All right, hi everyone. Today we're hosting Dove Gordon, professor at George Mason, who works in MPC and differential privacy. I think that's correct, right, Dove? Sure. And yeah, that's what I know about you at least. And today he's going to talk to us about large scale MPC.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to see people in person. I think this is my first in-person talk since COVID. I've been working on large-scale MPC for a few years. Before that, most of my work in MPC was small scale. And I think going back over my talk that I gave here 2.5 years ago, I actually covered this first one that's from Eurocrypt 21. So I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail, but I'm still going to bring it up just because the techniques there are going to be useful for the next two papers I'm going to try to cover. I'm being a little ambitious here, going over 3 results in an hour. I actually only have 30 slides and thought that I wasn't being that ambitious, but when I ran through it last night, it took me an hour. So feel free to interrupt. It doesn't matter if we don't get through it all. But I'm going to try and skim very quickly through that first result just to get the techniques that we need. And then I'll talk about these 2 newer results that I've been working on more recently. So this is joint work mostly with grad students at George Mason. Oh, I should say I'm on leave from George Mason for 2 years at a company called Triple Blind. It's a secure computation company that's doing that's applying MPC to medical data primarily. Also just chasing down whatever opportunities we can. So I'm there for 2 years, unless they don't survive, we'll see. but hopefully everything will go well. So yeah, mostly my students, also a few other people, names you might recognize. So let me jump in. So what is secure computation? I think most people at Galois at this point probably know this already, so I'm going to give you a very quick answer to that question. I'm not going to draw diagrams of triangles of computers connected. I'm not going to talk about real and ideal paradigms. It is simply computing on encrypted data, and I put it in quotes. Of course, fully homomorphic encryption is one example. So that is actually computing on encrypted data. We can all encrypt our data, send it to some cloud. The cloud can't see anything, but it can multiply and add plain text together. In the end, what you get is an encryption of the evaluated result. But I put it in quotes, of course, because we're also willing to allow other relaxations. In fact, these predated fully homomorphic encryption, of course. So we're going to use secret sharing, not just encryption. What's the difference? Really, it's just a question of how large your key is, roughly. Anyway, most of you probably also know what secret sharing is. We'll talk about it in a little more detail. But basically, we allow large keys or secret sharing to data as opposed to just encryptions, and we allow interaction. Because the interaction means that we're going to have communication that scales with the size of the computation itself, as opposed to fully homomorphic encryption. But the trade-off is that we'll have a lot less computation. And so over the last 20 years, all MPC research has basically been exploring this trade-off between computation and communication. Communication being bandwidth, but also latency. How do you reduce round complexity in exchange for more bandwidth, more computation, et cetera. So it's sort of these 3 resources in constant tension with one another. But all these together amount to the same thing, which is computing on encrypted data. So we're going to need a few different tools and techniques for the 3 different results I'm going to talk about. These 3 types of secret sharing schemes, I'm just going to lump them all together and not differentiate much between them. Shamir sharing, you probably have all seen before. Packed Shamir sharing, probably also, but I'll talk about it briefly just to remind you what it looks like. Additive secret sharing schemes. Here you need all n secret shares. So if there's n parties that share the secret, you have 1 share each. They all add up to the secret, and so you need every single share. So not very tolerant to faults, but very tolerant to corruptions. You have to have all n parties under your control to learn anything at all. And then homomorphic encryption, we only care about depth 1 or 2 multiplications here because it's more efficient. All right, so again, on that trade-off, everything I'm going to talk about today, you can pretty much solve with fully homomorphic encryption if you want to. But we're going to look at more efficient solutions in that trade-off between computation and communication. So I'll restrict ourselves to depth 1 or 2 multiplications, which makes things faster.
Sorry, before we continue, could Galois Portland mute themselves? Portland? Thank you.
Okay, so those are the different secret sharings we're going to use for our data. We're going to mix and match them to get the results that we want. We also need two different techniques, both in service of creating what's called beaver triples. Okay, so I'm going to use these square brackets most of the time just to say a secret sharing. It might be a homomorphic encryption, it might be an additive secret sharing, it might be a packed secret sharing. I prefer not to differentiate all the time unless it's necessary. So here a beaver triple might be encoded in any of those three ways, but the thing that doesn't change is that we have this relationship. A and B are random, and C is the product of the two. All right, so those are very useful for secure computation. If you don't know why, we'll show that briefly at the very end of the talk, but for now, just ignore it and just assume that all of secure computation boils down to constructing these beaver triples. The rest of it is actually very efficient once you have them, and like I said, we'll see it briefly at the end. So really, we want to know how to build these beaver triples, and we're going to use two different techniques and then a bunch of other clever ways of stitching them together to get whatever it is we're looking for. So I want to go over both of those techniques. I'll start with Damgard-Nielsen. So first, let me talk about Shamir sharing. So this is just a polynomial sharing. The idea here is that you take a random polynomial whose zero coefficient is the evaluation of the polynomial at point 0 is your secret. Okay, so here the secret is 2 in this example. And then you take any random polynomial with that constraint and evaluate that polynomial at position I to create the ith share. Okay, so party 1 gets the valuation of this random polynomial at point 1, in this case it's 3. Party 2 gets the evaluation at point 0, in case the outcome is 2. You give these evaluations to all the different parties, and any d plus 1 of them can fully reconstruct the secret. Any d of them can learn nothing at all. It's a very nice construction. Packed Shamir secret sharing is just a little bit more clever. Basically, you reserve some of that redundancy that you had in the polynomial evaluations for further secrets. Okay, so now we don't just have n shares and one secret. We have n minus L shares and L secrets, up to plus or minus 1. I always off by 1 errors and call myself a theorist. So, okay, so what's nice about these polynomial sharings when you're talking about secure computation is that we can add. So if I have 2 secrets and I've got 2 shares of 2 different, a share of each of 2 shares, 1 for each of 2 secrets, I can just add my shares together, and what I have is a share of the sum, right? Because polynomials add. And so the 0 term here would add as well. I can actually also multiply. If I multiply my 2 polynomials, then the evaluation at 0 also multiplies. So I can actually do everything I want to do, except for an important caveat that the degree of the polynomial doubles when I multiply. And so eventually you lose all the information that you need for reconstruction. So if you multiply too many times, in fact, more than once in all the settings we're going to discuss, you lose your information and you have to somehow figure out how to recover it before you go on. Okay. All right, so that's one of those 3 secret sharing schemes I said I was going to describe. I'm not going to describe the other 2. We'll just kind of treat them as black boxes, but I think they're pretty clear. And so now let me talk about this Eurocrypt 2021 paper. Like I said, I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail. In fact, the most interesting thing in that paper, I'll just kind of cover by way of, just as a side note. But the thing I want to focus on here is the Damgard-Nielsen technique, which we use in that protocol. And like I said, the aim in all of these protocols I'm presenting today is ultimately just to produce beaver triples. Okay, so in this protocol, we start out with the entire network, and throughout here today, figure that this network has tens of thousands of parties, maybe even more, hundreds of thousands. I like to think you could handle. And so when I say I compute among the entire network, every party here is going to be talking with 10,000, 20,000 other parties, which has all kinds of its own problems that we can talk about from an engineering perspective. I'm not going to bother, but I think they're all resolvable. And we start this protocol. So a general principle when you're dealing at scales this large is that you want to work in committees. You don't really want the entire network talking to one another, at least it seems. But it actually turns out that in certain instances, some of the communication is best done with the entire network. And in particular, the start of this protocol is going to begin with the entire network interacting with one another. And what we do is we create packed triples using those packed Shamir secret sharings. All right, so I'm gonna have to talk about how we do that. That's the Damgard-Nielsen technique, plus some other cleverness. But locally, I mean, not locally, among the entire network, we're gonna create a whole bunch of triples that are packed into these packed secret sharings. And then we're gonna transmit them to these committees that are gonna perform the online computation for us. Okay, so the cleverness in this I'll get to in a moment. This is actually the nicest part of this paper, was how we transferred these packed triples to these unpacking committees and what we do with them from there. But before I get to that, I think let me talk about the first step that I highlighted. Okay, but this is the outline of this Eurocrypt 2021 paper. And to get these triples here, we rely on the Damgard-Nielsen technique. So let me jump into that. So what does Damgard-Nielsen look like? The parties want to create A, B, and C, encoded in some secret sharing. Like I mentioned, they're going to be packed secret sharings. You can think of them as just Shamir secret sharings and leave the packing for later if it complicates things for us. And the basic steps are as follows. Everyone's going to create locally a random sharing of Ri, another sharing of the same Ri, but this time with double the degree in the polynomial, a sharing of a random AI, and a sharing of a random BI. They broadcast to the entire network. I'll come back again to why that's the right way, as opposed to doing this in small committees. Right? We could have divided our network up into tiny little committees of 100 or 200 parties, but I'm choosing not to. And once they've received 10,000 of these values, one from everybody else in the network, they all sum them up locally. You just sum your shares to get a share of the sum. And now what you have is this. You can perform a multiplication locally to get a degree 2D sharing of A times B. So when you multiply your shares of A and your shares of B, what you get is a degree 2D polynomial, so you doubled your degree. You mask it with the degree 2D polynomial encoding R, and now you send it to one single central dealer who can open it up, broadcast that value to everyone. No, sorry, not broadcast the value, re-encode it, reducing the degree of the polynomial. So we doubled the degree when we did our multiplication, we masked it, now we reduce the degree by opening this masked value to some dealer. And then once we receive these values back again, we subtract off the second copy of R. Okay, so it's just a simple addition, a single multiplication, and then a subtraction. One dealer in the middle has to do this polynomial interpolation to find this masked value. And then what you get is C, which is A times B. All right, so that gives us one triple. This isn't actually all that interesting, except that what Damgard-Nielsen realized is that you can do a lot better if you remove this inefficiency right here. So how much communication do we have to do? Everybody sent a share of R to the entire network. Okay, so that's N communication per party. And out of it, what we extracted was just a single triple. So now we have N communication per party for one triple, and we're going to have many, many, many of them. I'll call it C for the size of the circuit. Oh, that's a little bit confusing to have C here. Sometimes I call it M just to make it more confusing. But anyway, very many, right? This is the metric we're going to use today for our communication costs, is how much do we have to communicate per triple in our computation. And here we have each party sending N values for one triple, which is pretty poor. And what Damgard-Nielsen realized is that there's a lot of randomness here being left on the table. Instead of everybody sending one share that just gets summed up into a single triple, we can extract multiple triples if we use a Vandermonde matrix and treat it as a randomness extractor. So as long as there's enough entropy in these N values sent by the N parties, all to one another, we can extract O of N triples by using this single matrix vector multiplication. And because this matrix is public knowledge, everyone knows the matrix, you can multiply it with your secret sharing without increasing the degree of the polynomial. So the multiplication is, so to speak, for free. All right, so how many can we get out of it? I say O of N. It depends on how many honest parties you have. So if the malicious parties aren't contributing any entropy, imagine instead of sending random values, they just send all zeros, then you can't really extract anything from that. But the honest parties can be trusted to send truly random values, so you can extract essentially that number of good triples by doing this matrix multiplication. All right, so that gets back to the question of why we wanted to compute this in the large network. There's actually two reasons. The first one I didn't mention before, but one reason now is because the more honest parties we have in this first step, the more triples we can extract for that O of n per party communication. The second reason is because we're going to do this using packed values, which is not something that Damgard-Nielsen had done, and that's going to shave yet another factor of n. Because if you remember, I can pack O of n values into my packed secret sharing, and that'll let me shave yet another factor of n off the cost. So if we had instead, this is something we will do in other cases here, is refine our, we got this large network of, let's say, 100,000 parties, and in this case, we're assuming about 2/3 of them are honest. We could select small committees, probably of about size, I don't know, 200 or 300 parties, and have a guarantee that a majority of them are honest. So if we start with a 2/3 honest assumption, and we select a committee, we can get a relatively small committee. It's independent of n, it only depends on the security parameter, where half are honest. So we've reduced our assumption from 2/3 honest to half honest and get a relatively small committee. But then we wouldn't be able to extract as many triples for our communication, and we wouldn't be able to pack either. So we use a factor of n savings. Okay, so that's Damgard-Nielsen. We're going to use it in the later protocols. Maybe now I'll just quickly mention what was the idea behind this Eurocrypt paper. So we've done this triple generation inside the whole network. We shaved a factor of n off the communication by using this Vandermonde trick of Damgard-Nielsen. We shaved another factor of n by using packed secret sharing. But the problem is that computing on packed secret sharing adds some overhead that we would like to avoid. So one way you can compute on packed secrets is you can assume your circuit just has a lot of parallelism. If you're computing the same thing in parallel over and over again, you don't ever have to unpack them. You can just compute all the multiplications on all those values at once, all the additions on all those values at once. But we were looking for a general result. In fact, I even like the idea of thinking of this as a triple service, where you stand this up and now you sell triples to people who want to do computations. So I don't necessarily want to do this on packed values. I might want to do this with 3 parties or 8 parties. Maybe some of my clients have an honest majority assumption, some have an n-1 corruption assumption. I want to be able to have these additive secret shares of triples that I can farm out for different computations, and maybe not parallel ones. Maybe I'm going to use these, out of 100,000 parties in this network, we can create millions or billions of triples in this way very quickly, but then we aren't necessarily using them in one computation. We may want to farm them out for multiple computations and so lose all that parallelism. So I don't want to compute on packed values, but there's kind of a catch-22 here. If I have to unpack these things, I lose that savings of n when I transfer them to the computing committees. Oh, the other thing to note is that I want to compute, well, I think I mentioned this without stressing it. I want to compute in very small committees because that'll be much more efficient than computing among 100,000 parties. There's no added value. Once I've generated these triples in this way, the Damgard-Nielsen trick of using that extractor and the packing, all of that was great, but once I'm done generating my triples, I actually would just rather have a very small committee, maybe a size 15, with a guarantee that one party is honest. That would suffice. I don't need 250 and certainly not 100,000 parties computing the same thing in parallel and wasting all that resource. So I need to get these triples out, but if I get them out first, in this bottom step here among the whole network and then send them, I've lost that savings of n that I gained in the first place. And if I send them to this small committee, there aren't enough parties there to hold a packed secret sharing anymore. I've lost my honest majority assumption or strong honest majority assumption that I needed. And so the idea that we had is that if we first additively secret share our packed secret shares, all right, so it's a nested secret sharing here, then it's kind of like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Craig Gentry's talk about homomorphic encryption. Inside this box, which is the additive secret sharing, I can perform the linear operations that are required to unpack into additive shares of these triples. So I get this for free. I get to send these packed values to these small little committees who have additive shares of the packed shares, and they can unpack these things into additive shares without ever seeing. And now what I have is a whole bunch of triples, let's say 1 billion of them sitting in these committees that can use them for whatever they want. All right, so I won't go any more into that paper except just to give you the bottom line of the asymptotics. We compare to other ways you might have used committee-based computation, where you just kind of divvy up your circuit among honest majority committees or malicious majority committees. S here is the committee size, which varies in those two settings. So if you have an honest majority You can think of S as being like, I don't know, like I said, 200 or 300. In a malicious majority, S can be much smaller because your guarantee is much looser. You only need one honest participant to be secure. But the communication cost in these malicious majority protocols is quadratic rather than linear. And so you end up, say this is like 15 here or 20 if you started with a strong honest majority, but then squared, this becomes probably even bigger than this value S here. So we do better almost across the board here, which is nice. And I'm hiding constants here. So I mean, the paper, we actually have more benchmarks and estimates. It's not quite as rosy as the asymptotic suggests, but I think still a pretty clear win over these other approaches. Okay, so I'm going to start now talking about the other tool we need, which is speeds. And then after 2 slides, I'll move into some newer results. So what is the speeds protocol? I'm not going to talk about it in detail. I'm not going to talk about the malicious setting in particular. I'm just going to focus on semi-honest speeds, which actually looks very similar to what we just talked about. Once you replace the square brackets for Shamir sharing with square brackets for homomorphic encryption, it's essentially the same protocol. So each party here is going to generate random values for their share of A, random values for their share of B, and they encrypt them and broadcast to everybody. Just like we did in the first step, except there we were using in the previous protocol, but there we were using Shamir sharing, and here we're using some homomorphic encryption, but otherwise it's the same. Everyone gets these values and sums them up. That gives them A and B for a single triple. Same problem we had before here, where there was a lot of waste because everyone sent n values and we're only extracting a single triple, so we'll address that. And then they use the homomorphic operation for this encryption scheme to multiply these values to get C. Just like in the previous protocol, we can multiply polynomial shares to get a sharing of A times B. All right, and then they use the threshold decryption of the FHE scheme to get additive sharing of A, B, and C. And the thing I'm skipping here is that we have to authenticate these shares if we're in the malicious setting. So there's another multiplication done there to authenticate with this value alpha that'll allow us to check that nobody's changed these additive shares as we go. I'm going to brush over that. There's other things that have to be done here. When you use somewhat homomorphic encryption, you have to prove that you used good randomness, because if your randomness came from the wrong domain, then you could actually cause an overflow, which leads to a selective failure attack. So there's zero knowledge proof that's needed to prove that your ciphertext is well formed. I'm not going to go into that. But basically, the semi-honest construction here is like what we saw before. Okay, but now we still have the same inefficiency, this broadcast step here, right? Everybody had to send an encryption of AI and BI to everyone else in the network. So the total cost was n squared, the per party cost was O of n. And out of it, we got just a single triple, which is pretty bad. But we can't use Vandermonde just because of the same, what I said before. If we only have one honest party in this network now, so speeds has the assumption that T is less than n, which is a pretty weak assumption, then I can't extract, right? I may only have one good random value here, so extraction is pointless. So the question then is, how can we get rid of this broadcast step if we want to reduce the communication cost? And there's a sort of obvious idea, though how to make it work is not obvious. Instead of sending this around and having everyone locally do the summation and the multiplication, let's just send it to one designated party and have them do it for us. All right, so they can receive these values, sum them up, multiply, and then send it back again. So we all send one value to the dealer, or, well, a constant number of values, A and B, to the dealer. The dealer has to perform these operations and then send it to n parties. The per party cost is still constant. Right, and we can load balance. We don't have to have one dealer doing all the triples. If we need millions of triples, and we can have millions of dealers. So this sounds like the right way to go, except how do we know that this dealer did what it's supposed to do? Right? We give him these ciphertexts, and it comes back and says, okay, here's the results from summing your ciphertexts and multiplying them together. And how do we know that it did that? Right? In particular, it can do a lot of really damaging things here. It could just swap out the triple we actually generated for its own triple that it knows. And if it knows the triple, it can actually recover all of the data in the computation later. Or it could give us bad triples that don't satisfy the relationship they're supposed to satisfy. Actually, the first attack would be much worse, and so we can stop right there. All right, so how do we make sure that this dealer did the right thing and that it didn't just give us its own triple? And the idea here is that we want to prove that A is correct. So it's going to take these encryptions of shares of A, add them up, and then send us that ciphertext. We can actually do the multiplication ourselves. That would be fine, right? The communication cost here is just the A1 to AN that we have to worry about. But how do we know that it summed them correctly? So we want to come up with some proof that the summation is correct. But what are we proving? We're proving it's correct with respect to what? Party I only knows AI and doesn't know any of these other values, right? So whatever value it receives is in some sense consistent with the AI that it sent, right? I have nothing here to constrain the problem. I need an NP statement to pin this to, or else how do I even verify that things are correct? Actually, there is a clever way to do this in a black box way using signature schemes. If you assume a PKI and zero knowledge proofs, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to stick with my intuition, which I had before hearing about that answer, which is that we need some information. Everybody needs information about the other ciphertexts, the ones they did not generate. Okay, but the problem is that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. I could send that to you. I could send you those ciphertexts exactly, but that's where we got into this whole thing in the first place, is I don't want to do that. I want to avoid that communication. And the answer, as always often the case in these types of situations, is that you want to amortize. We've got lots and lots and lots of triples, much more than n. And so what I can do is I can't send you every share that I have, but I can send you enough information about all of the shares I've created across those M to be able to convince you that the dealer was honest. Okay, so here's our verified sum protocol. It's going to rely on a commitment scheme and a homomorphic hash function. I'll define the homomorphic hash function for you because it's not that standard. Basically, what it sounds like, though, it's a hash function where the sum of the hashes is equal to the hash of the sums. Okay, so this is it's not actually a sum. It's really going to be a product when we instantiate this with the discrete log assumption, but I still like to say it that way because it sounds nice. But if I hash A and I hash B and I perform some operation, what I get is the hash of A plus B. All right, and we still want the standard notion of collision resistance. It should be hard to find pre-images that collide under this hash function. And you can build this with a textbook hash function. This is actually literally in the textbook by Katz and Dell. I teach this to my undergrads. The key for the hash function is just M generators from some group where discrete log is hard. The input is these integers, and you just compute the product of these exponentiations, and that's your hash. And you can verify very easily that this has the homomorphic property that you want. So what are we going to do with it? So party one holds shares of every triple we're going to generate. We're going to generate many, many, many triples, right? M here is our circuit size. That's, you know, in the millions and billions. And that's where we get our savings through amortization. So the first thing that the parties do is they do send a broadcast. They're going to send some information to everyone in the network. So we are going to incur that n squared communication from broadcast, but it'll be amortized across all of our triples that we're going to generate. So what you do is you hash your shares of every triple. Technicality there to make the proof go through. I want to make sure that my triples aren't based on, your triples aren't based on mine, so we do a commit and reveal. And then after we've received these n hashes from everybody, we sum them up and verify that we all received the same thing. Okay, so we're just kind of preventing any cheating here. Now we all have agreed on a single hash of all of the shares of the triples that we'll eventually get from the dealer. We send these values to the dealer who does the summation like it's supposed to. Okay, so now it's summing across the n parties here in each of the m slots that will eventually constitute our m triples for our circuit. Okay, so it's going to have m ciphertexts after summing these values, and it sends those m ciphertexts around. Each one is an encryption of A from a triple. It does the same with B, and we can all compute A times B ourselves locally. And the check now is very simple, right? The property of our hash function was that the sum of the hash is equal to the hash of the sums. So we can simply check that what we received here, if we hash those m values, is the same as the sum of the hashes we received from everybody else previously. All right, so now we've amortized away that cost of that broadcast, and we shaved off that same factor of n that you were able to save in that Damgard-Nielsen construction. So we're still in the middle of running experiments. That's why this is only on eprint and hasn't been published yet. But so far it looks pretty promising. I mean, the communication, matches what we would expect. We're getting lower communication starting with just 10 parties. So I think this is probably the better protocol to use if communications are concerned, pretty quickly. I mean, if you have 3 or 4 parties, maybe not, but already 50% less communication at 20 parties. So there is going to be some added computational costs, and I don't think Daniel's done experiments for that yet, but you're doing two exponentiations per triple. So if you compare that to the homomorphic operations we have to do and the zero knowledge proofs that we have to do, I think it's going to be only a small constant multiple worse. It won't be twice as bad, much less than that. So I think this will pay off end to end with just a few dozen parties or something. All right, a few footnotes for the people that like the weeds, and then I'll move on to the more recent work. Nothing here, no real caveats. If you zoned out for this slide, you'd be missing nothing. But one thing that we also have to handle are, like I said, the zero knowledge proofs that the randomness in these ciphertexts are handled correctly. So it turns out that those zero knowledge proofs are nicely summed as well. So we can just apply the same verify sum protocol to the zero knowledge proofs that are needed in speeds. And that's actually kind of something similar we've already observed in prior work. We can't prove that this realizes the natural functionality that we'd like to prove. Like I'd like to say that, everybody can submit whatever input they'd like to this dealer and be sure that the summation is correct. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It only holds if your inputs come from some random looking distribution, like ciphertext, for example. So it's good enough for us. We spent a long time trying to think about, relaxations to MPC that depend on the input distribution. So it's claiming that simulation only holds if the input comes from the right distribution. These kinds of definitions seem to be really problematic. We couldn't come up with something that works. And so we ended up abandoning that. And instead we did what a lot of people do in this space, which is we just prove security end to end and give up on the modularity that MPC usually gives you. So it's kind of ugly from the presentation standpoint, but if anybody has ideas how to make things like this more modular, I think it'd be really interesting, because this kind of thing ends up coming up all the time, and we end up with very ugly proofs that are not very convincing for that reason. And then one other thing that I think is interesting to practitioners, we don't actually need full collision resistance here. You can't really build collision resistant homomorphic hashes from things like lattice assumptions, as far as I can tell. Actually, I missed this. It was Craig Gentry who pointed this out to me. If your inputs are coming from a space controlled by the adversary, then you can run attacks to recover the hash key because everything is linear there. And so, with the discrete log assumption, it seems to bypass that. But in this case, we actually don't have inputs that are controlled by the adversary. Again, they're random looking. They're coming from this high entropy source. They're ciphertext generated by other parties. And so I think you can get away here with using lattices. The asymptotics are worse, so we didn't pursue it, but I think you might have better runtime. So I think it'd be worth looking at if you're trying to speed these things up. Okay, so that brings me to the most recent work, which is still ongoing, hoping to get it up on eprint sometime soon. But the question of how to guarantee output. Okay, so additive secret sharing, actually even the first result that I talked about, that Eurocrypt paper, is not robust to failures. There's a little bit you can do to make it more robust to failures, but you'll give up on some of the nice efficiencies that we found in the computational side of things. Basically, you won't be able to use fast Fourier transform, so you'll incur an extra log n computational cost. But the one I just presented based on speeds, there's no robustness, right? Additive secret shares, you need all n participants to be able to cover anything. And so there's no tolerance here for failures. And in large scale MPC, that's completely absurd. You can't hope to have 100,000 parties computing and nobody goes offline, right? It doesn't matter how fast your computation, how simple your computation is. And of course, we want to do very complex computations. So this whole idea is kind of at a dead end unless you can somehow build in some measure of robustness. But unfortunately, we kind of know from classical results in MPC that there isn't that much you can do. If you have t less than n over 2, if you have t less than n corruptions, which is what we were just considering in this last work based on speeds, you can't guarantee output. Okay, so I mean, in the first protocol that I presented, where we assumed a strong honest majority, you could hope to give some robustness, and that's a nice open question. But the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on this malicious majority setting. So t less than n, I'd like to have some notion of robustness, and the classical results say give up hope. And actually, it's worth pointing out that even when you do have an honest majority, existing results are pretty deficient. So you can do full execution of FHE, right? So if you have a complex computation, you know that that's very expensive, but that is one way of getting guarantees of output. And the other approach that's based on more standard MPC techniques, they very nicely are able to claim a match in asymptotics with Damgard-Nielsen, but they kind of hide in their big O notation in n to the 6th term. We managed to get it down to n to the 5th when we started on this work by using computational assumptions. This is work by Pool Goyal et al. They have n to the 6th with information theoretic assumptions. But it seems we're kind of stuck here. And I will admit you could do better if you're optimistic. So if failures don't happen that often or are unlikely to happen, then I think this actually is much better as additive term. But still, if there are going to be significant failures, you're stuck with this really awful, really completely impractical n to the 5th term here. So we went back to the definitions and decided it was time to come up with a new one. Why is it that we classical output guarantees can't extend beyond n over 2 corruptions, and why are we stuck with these sort of really inefficient constructions? They're intentionally very strong. The guarantee in the standard setting essentially looks at the worst case of failure profiles. So they're assuming that the adversary controls all aborts. In fact, any abort that occurs is considered malicious behavior. And there's good reason for that. I mean, for one thing, it makes things much cleaner. So it is a little bit messy to define honest aborts in MPC, although we're going to do that in this work. But the other thing is that it makes sense that you don't want to assume some structured failure distribution, right? I mean, the adversary certainly can, whoever it has corrupted, it can time their failures. And so you want to be robust against those timed failures that might happen in the worst case, right? And that might be aligned to happen in the worst sort of pattern of failure. So these are all the motivations for the classical definitions, and they do make a lot of sense, except that we kind of run into this wall that I'm describing. But it's also worth pointing out that in reality, failing is very likely to be an honest behavior. I mean, first of all, it's worth noting that honest nodes do fail, right? So we treat them as though they're malicious in the classical definitions, but let's admit that, of course, that isn't necessarily true. But more importantly, I don't really believe that adversaries care to perform denial of service attacks in this way. Like, there are millions of denial of service attacks where you don't have to have a foothold in every year. There are millions of denial of service attacks. You don't have to have a foothold in the participants in some protocol in order to execute them. The idea that someone's going to corrupt machines, install different MPC software just to time the failures so that the protocol fails seems a little bit suspicious, a little, overly paranoid, let's say. I mean, I suppose one thing that would be nice about doing it that way, as opposed to just flooding your network, is that it wouldn't be detectable. Although, I'm just thinking out loud here. I mean, it's still detectable that something went wrong, right? And if someone floods your network, it's not clear who did it either. So in some sense, you're detecting the same thing. Anyway, I think from the smiles in the room, everyone agrees with me. This is a pretty roundabout way of preventing the computation from continuing. So I think it's reasonable to say that failures are very likely to be honest, not malicious. And so, coming at it at that light, what new definition might we give that'll allow us to build things that are more efficient? Okay, so we define something called churn resilient MPC. It's actually very subtle coming up with the right definition. We spent a lot of time on it already. I'm still not sure that we have everything right, but I'm going to give you just kind of the high level idea of the definition, because the details could take a long time. But we say that a protocol is T alpha churn resilient if it has two security properties. The T is the corruption threshold. But here we're going to deal with this standard classical notion of secure with abort. So there's no output guarantee in this first property. What we're guaranteeing is security and privacy, even when parties act badly. And here T might be more than n over 2. So we're kind of staying with that malicious majority setting. Those T corrupt parties may act completely arbitrarily. They still can choose to fail whenever they want to, but I'm not going to guarantee output when they do that. So if they choose a bad failure distribution, it may be that they do in fact perform this denial of service attack. The other property is our output property. Here, if all parties do play honest, then we can still guarantee output as long as they fail according to some sort of specified distribution. So the one that we consider, although you can generalize beyond this, but the one that we consider is, I think, a very natural one. Each party fails with independent probability according to some rate alpha. So for any fixed unit of time, the probability that they fail in that time is determined by this, failure rate, which is measured in, failure probability per second. Okay, so they're all independent, and you don't have to have them be independent. You could imagine correlations. Maybe certain parties are more likely to fail, have a higher failure rate than other parties. You could do all kinds of very natural things here, and it doesn't hurt the definition, but this one just makes it easier to talk about things.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Prefaced with, this is probably a dumb question because I'm not an NPC person. But for this distribution, is that in reference to you have the failure rate of all your members, and that creates the distribution of failure rates?
Yeah, so no, sorry. So you could do that, and that wouldn't hurt the definition, but we took a simpler approach. Each party over any unit of time, well, say some fixed unit of time has probability.
Some pulled from a distribution.
No, so everyone has a fixed probability of failing in each second.
Oh.
And conditioned on them not having failed until now, the probability they fail in the next second is alpha. Right.
Changes as time progresses, like based on
No, it doesn't. I mean, it does not change, right? So it's, in any, let's say, if my unit of time is a second, then my failure probability might be 1/10. And if you now ask what's the probability I fail over a minute, then you'll take an interval over, 10 of those, 6 of those units.
Oh, so the probability, the rate is the same at all times.
Yeah, it's a fixed
Okay,
rate.
sorry, I was thinking this was
failure
the
rate.
probability of various rates. Okay.
Right. So you could build in that kind of flexibility if you want to, and it just makes things very messy, but it doesn't fundamentally change the definition. So then the guarantee is that under that failure profile, we get output with all the negligible probability. Okay, but here we're assuming that all parties act honestly. So the security and privacy come from guarantee 1. The output guarantee only holds if parties are failing according to this distribution and otherwise acting honestly. Okay, so this is again motivated by what I said before. I don't really believe that malicious parties are trying to cause us to fail. They might be trying to do other things, but failure, I think, is unlikely, and so we're very likely to get output, under that assumption. So then we kind of refine into 2 categories of these failure probabilities, these failure rates. The low churn setting, where with overwhelming probability, some honest party completes the protocol. Okay, that's a nice assumption that makes things a lot easier. And was called the high churn setting, which also recently called fluid MPC, where you have such a high failure rate that the whole network could disappear before you're done with your computation. And so, of course, we have to assume other parties are coming in to take their place. So now we have like this turnover as we're computing. And so then we kind of need access to some communication channel that persists. So we assume access to a blockchain. So we consider both of these 2 settings and have protocol design for each separately. So I'll start with a quick impossibility result. It's not the more interesting result in our paper, but it kind of motivates the setting where we have a protocol. So you have to have at least kappa honest parties in the low churn setting. Right, kappa here is some security parameter. You can't have, for example, a single honest party like you do with speeds. And the intuition might even be immediately clear. If there's only a single party that's honest, there is some noticeable probability that they'll fail over the course of the protocol. Right, alpha here was some constant; it wasn't some negligible failure rate. And once they're gone, what happens? You have, the whole network is now controlled by the adversary. But formalizing that's a little bit trickier than that. Roughly, it looks something like this. So property 2, which says that we guarantee output under this random failure distribution. It says that if that one honest party fails, everyone else can still recover the output. In the early rounds, intuitively, and of course that has to be formalized, the output does not incorporate the honest input, right? So before you start even communicating, of course, no one knows my input. And as we progress, at some point, my input becomes incorporated into the result. And so we can show that because there's this dichotomy, right? At some point, my input was not used, but then later my input was used. There's some point in the protocol where the adversary can kind of gain some advantage to learn the results that does incorporate the input, and then afterwards change the results by abandoning some of its own controlled parties. Okay, so first you learn how the honest input will impact the result, and then you can decide immediately who to terminate so that the output result actually changes based on those terminations. Right, this is something you shouldn't be able to do in the ideal world. In the ideal world, you submit your input, you get a result. You shouldn't be able to see the result and then somehow manipulate the output. And a nice example of where an attack like this, I think, is very clear. Imagine I'm participating in an auction. I don't want to buy this thing, but I want to know how much value it has to you. So then what I could do is I could run just long enough to see whether you're likely to have won. Right? So I want to run to the point where if you failed, the result of the auction would still be determined. And I'll just pretend you failed and run the protocol till the end to see whether or not you would have won. And then, because all of that was done in my head, I can very quickly now abandon a few parties, the ones that would have bid, say, more than X, right? I'm trying to decide whether X would have won the auction for you. I'll abandon those parties to make sure I don't end up buying the thing. And those bids will not be included. Okay, so we have to have some core number of honest parties involved in this. Interestingly, this impossibility result does not hold in the high churn setting. That's kind of surprised me. It seems like the high churn setting is the more complicated one, and I think it is, right, for designing protocols. But the fact that parties might come back actually bypasses this impossibility result. And so you can actually describe a very trivial, uninteresting protocol where you kind of, anytime someone fails, you just wait till they eventually come back again, and then kind of ensure that you have your output guarantee that way. So we design more interesting protocols, but what we're going to do now, motivated by the fact that we have to have some core number of honest parties involved in the protocol, it can't just be a constant number of honest parties. We're going to assume O of n honest parties, but we're going to, we're not going to restrict ourselves to n over 2. You could imagine 3/4 of the network is malicious, 90% of the network is malicious, and we're going to focus on that setting.
There's some relationship between kappa and that alpha failure in your name.
No. I don't think so. I mean, maybe when we're carefully formal, we have to let alpha change as a function of the security parameter, but I don't think so. Okay, so what's the design principles behind this new protocol? I'm going to quickly present. We want to be committee based, just like we were in those other protocols. I don't want to, I don't want the whole network involved unless there's some real reason for it. And because we're in a malicious majority setting, there really won't be a reason for it this time. But the other thing that kind of comes out of this whole model is that we want small secret stakes. I don't actually have a good, compelling argument for why. It's just more of an intuition. But if a party disappears, then they hold 1 share of 1 million triples. All those triples are wasted, right? We can't use them anymore because there's no way to recover them. So I need some redundancy built into this if that party is going to disappear. Otherwise, I have to redo all that computation, which is an option. You could just have many, many committees. In fact, I have a different paper I didn't mention today where we did do that. We just had a lot of committees generating triples, and if one of them failed, we threw that one away. Right? You just lose X% of your triples to failures. But that's really expensive. So instead, what we want to do is have very small secret states so that anybody who fails is very unlikely to impact what we need to know. We can just get rid of them and not worry about them. And now what does the protocol look like? We're gonna have O of n committees, each of size S. Again, S is this like, it's based only on the statistical security parameter. But what we need is that at least one honest party will survive the role of that committee with high probability. So this can be a pretty small committee. Even if you have 80% corruption in the network, this committee could be, I don't know, under 100 parties. And then the role of each committee is to generate ciphertext encrypting triples. Okay, so we're not going to use additive sharing for the reason I just said a minute ago. It's too much secret state. All of our triples will remain in encrypted form, and that way they're just duplicated among everybody on the committee. If one party disappears, it doesn't matter because the rest of us hold the same ciphertext. We're not relying on their share of that triple. We need a secret somewhere, of course, and that's the decryption committee, which holds the threshold sharing of the FHE key. So that committee has to be large enough. So first of all, because it's malicious majority, the degree of the polynomial has to be pretty large, but we can still get some redundancy in there. And the size of the committee has to be large enough that one of the honest parties, well, that enough parties will survive, I should say, so that we can still use the FHE key. If too much of that committee dies, then the secret's gone, and we can't continue the computation. Okay, so you just have to pick that committee large enough. All right, so then the protocol is actually very simple, given what we've seen already today. Everyone encrypts their share of A and their share of B, and they send it to the committee. So instead of sending to a dealer, now we're sending to the committee. The committee holds these ciphertexts. And now we go back to Vandermonde. Because we have this O of n honesty assumption, we can extract O of n triples out of this. And again, because Vandermonde is a public matrix, we don't increase the multiplicative depth of our FHE here. We can just multiply our vector of ciphertext by this public matrix, essentially for free. I mean, there's computational cost, but not the heavy cost of FHE. We locally compute the product just like before. We actually also locally compute the authentication. So standard speeds didn't do that. They actually open the ciphertext into shares, then multiply again with the authentication. They wanted to keep a depth 1 FHE instead of a depth 2, but we're benchmarking it to show that it's not a big loss, and that way we never have to go to additive sharing. So we can maintain this small state. And then the rest of it just looks like standard online speeds, which I promised earlier I would show you. What do you do with these triples? Well, let's suppose we have some data values, X and Y, right? So they're not random A and B anymore, but values we care about and want to multiply them. Well, if you don't know MPC, so it's worth mentioning, you can add these values locally, just like we did with our shares earlier. It's the multiplication that's hard. And so here we're going to use our triples for multiplication of X and Y. Everyone first homomorphically adds X plus A, where A is the value from the triple. They homomorphically add Y plus B. Then they send these to the decryption committee, who can broadcast X plus A and Y plus B as constants. And you can use those public values. You multiply by Y here, you multiply by X here, you multiply the two public values and subtract, and then you add homomorphically this ciphertext, and what you get is exactly encryption of XY. So this is something you can just verify offline. It's just standard use of Beaver, except instead of additive sharing, we're using homomorphic sharing. We use square brackets for both that look exactly the same. All right, so that's the protocol. And so let me just wrap up by summarizing the results in each of these three cases. So the last two that I presented in these newer works, what we did is we shaved a factor of n from this C term, right? C is the circuit. I think there's a large neural network. There's kind of a caveat I put into the abstract. I don't know if anyone noticed that, but we still have dependency here on n. I haven't gotten rid of that. So each party will have to communicate more for each n, but if C dominates n, then we don't care. However, it's kind of cheating a little bit if C also grows with n, right? Because I've kind of pretended here that C is independent of n. And so you have to kind of work to find the right circuit for which these asymptotics make sense. But I mean, I like the example of a large neural network with some fixed training set size, right? You don't, the training set size doesn't necessarily depend on n. You might have thousands of parties or tens or hundreds of thousands of parties willing to contribute to this computation. They're not necessarily the data providers. You're just going to them for your computation network. And the data is some fixed size independent of n. The circuit is very, very large compared to n, if it's a complicated model. And the cost per party here doesn't grow in the term that matters then. In that first result that I mentioned, we have this magical property that the cost per party actually reduces as n increases. So title that paper, the more the merrier, because by adding to this large network, we can actually more efficiently generate those triples and handle bigger computations as more parties join. That's it. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to take questions for the few minutes that I didn't use. Hi.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that the protocol for generating, one of the protocols that you described for generating the pivot triples cannot be formalized as an ideal functionality.
Yeah. This verified sum protocol. Yeah.
Right. So I was wondering, right, why? Yeah. What's the reason why this?
Yeah. So it's been a while since I thought about it. So I'm not sure that I remember. I mean, it's very technical, but I don't think I'll be able to.
Okay, that's yeah.
On the fly. Yeah, I mean, something goes wrong with the simulation.
I see. I see.
You know, you have to rewind in a place where you really can't.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember anymore.
Okay, and so instead of defining it with an ideal functionality, we kind of define it as some kind of.
No, so I just don't define anything there. What I do instead is I plug it into the protocol in like 6 different places.
Oh, I see.
And then I just say this whole protocol realizes the functionality that you want, and then I can, because the input. So I mean, I can say a little bit actually. I mean, what happens, you know, in the standard notion of MPC is the simulator is given the malicious input, and the honest parties are given their input, and then you're supposed to interact and simulate, right? But if it's part of a larger protocol, the input didn't necessarily come from some distinguisher that can choose it arbitrarily. It came from the protocol. In fact, it might have come from the simulator itself. The simulator might have been responsible for creating those values that were then being used in the verified sum. So it might even know, you know, so if you're giving some random ciphertext of random values, the simulator might already know the values, which gives it a big leg up in simulation. If you treat it as a black box, those values are chosen by a distinguisher arbitrarily. It can choose the distribution and then try to use that to distinguish, and it becomes a harder job for the simulator to figure it out.
I see.
And it seems like we have something in between here, because these values were guaranteed to come from some high entropy source, these you know, random looking ciphertexts. So like, it seems like if you just said that the distinguisher is restricted to that same requirement, we should be able to define kind of a same modular definition, but it doesn't seem to work.
I see. So you fix the distribution, and then the distinguisher. So the distinguisher doesn't pick the distribution.
Right. In the standard definition, it's the distinguisher that gets to pick the distribution, and the simulator has to be able to handle it for all distinguishers, for all distributions that it might have chosen. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And in reality, if it's plugged into a protocol, there is no choice in the distribution. Protocol specifies.
Right.
Richard, are there any comments online?
Nope, there were not.
Well,
Okay.
let's thank our speaker.
Thanks, Dov.